Hello. Do you know the true history of Columbus Day?
On today's episode of the Unselects, we're going to provide you the true history of Columbus Day and how it came to be. I'm Greg Richards.
And I'm Brian Costello, and we are the Unselects.
Hey, Brian, today we're going to explore Columbus Day, the truth of it. I know that it's one of those holidays, I think, that has a lot of criticism you hear out there, not only on a national level, but on a local level. And, I have a lot of people in my family who have some Italian heritage. A lot of people out here watching probably do. And I think it's really important that we at least try to provide the truth and how the holiday came to be and not how it's been portrayed nowadays. So that's what we're going to dig in today.
That's great, and I think it's important to basically think about history, right? A lot of times people argue about things, but even those that are for don't actually know the true history. And Absolutely. I think this will give us an opportunity to kind of go through where did it come from?
Exactly. First thing we're going to do, we're going to go back to 2020. I think a lot of these things you would go back to, the ever elusive 2020 and some of the things we saw happening around the country. And first clip we're going to go to is going to go to that, what happened in Baltimore around a Columbus statue. So let's take a look.
July 4th at about 8 p.m., the mob turned to the statue. They brought it down, it fell, it broke in several pieces. They drug it over to where the harbor was, and they dumped it in the harbor. I'm a first-generation American. My Italian heritage means everything to me. Columbus Day was part of that heritage. And when the statue came down, I was devastated. I was angry. That's our heritage in the harbor. We hired a diver, a crane, a tractor trailer to haul the remains. So we're in the process of trying to restore the statue back to its original look, because that Columbus statue is a symbol that we can look up to and make us proud of not only being Italians, but being Americans in this country.
So, Brian, a couple things of what he said, because this is where I think we want to differentiate the man versus the impact. If you look at, as a lot of Italians view Columbus Day as part of their heritage, and it's about being Italian, it's not about Columbus as a person. And I think that's where we start of when people look at and criticize Columbus Day, they're looking at it from a standpoint of Columbus the man, not about the culture and the Italians and where this came from, which is what we're going to dive in today. Fair?
Yeah, correct. I mean, this is what it is. It's your average person that's of Italian heritage. They don't look at it solely from a person's name. It's their heritage.
Exactly. And what you actually saw, in 2020, we're bringing down statues around the country, but you actually see it manifest itself where there's kind of this initiative, and you see it in Massachusetts a lot, where towns specifically are saying, oh, we think we should strike the name Columbus Day and, in favor of, Indigenous Peoples Day. So I want to go to a clip here of back in 2021 in Newton, and I think when they had their first celebration of the quote-unquote Indigenous Peoples Day. So let's take a look at that.
In Newton, a celebration of its first ever Indigenous Peoples Day.
This has been a long time coming.
Organizers say there are now more than 24 Massachusetts communities acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day. They add there should be no more Columbus Day.
He is not a person that should be celebrated. There was nothing about that person that should be celebrated.
Days ago, Boston's acting mayor signed an executive order replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Italian Americans in Boston's North End celebrating Columbus anyway in the park named after him.
This is one giant brainwashing campaign that is literally removing Italian Americans and making them a footnote in the history of Boston.
One of the things I want to highlight there, I think we talked about a little bit, is why do we have to replace, right? I think you had some comments about there's a lot of different cultures in the country. Why does it have to be one versus the other?
Yeah, if you think about it, we should be celebrating Native American cultures. We should be celebrating many of them. There were a lot of different cultures of indigenous tribes that actually were in North America, right? I think the complaint is on the Columbus Day side is really about, hey, you took our kind of heritage and you replaced it with something because you're angry with the name. We can do both. You don't have to actually have one over the other. And I think that's what makes people more angry that are looking at the replacement.
Right. And I think, which we're going to get to here, the thing I want to stress is, you heard one person say that there was nothing to celebrate about the man, and that you saw, I guess, the other side of it with the the Italian woman there saying, it's a brainwashing exercise, because I think what she's alluding to is people don't take the time to understand, right? And if you're going to criticize, take the time to understand and kind of make your case on it, right? And that's what we're going to aim to do today. I do want to go to, is we like to highlight, one of the things we do like to do is when we see elected officials kind of exhibiting behaviors of, supporting those who put them there, I like to highlight it. So I'm going to go to a video here. There's actually a representative, Jeff Turco, he's in Winthrop and Revere, and he was in front of the actual, I think, the state, kind of making a case for why this is not a good idea and what the impact could be. So let's take a listen.
Nobody objects to creating an Indigenous People Day, but to pit one group of people against another people, I think, is an unfortunate approach. This Commonwealth can rightly recognize Indigenous people without throwing the Italian people collectively under the bus. If we wanted to change, Columbus Day and call it Italian American Heritage Day, Italian American Heritage Month, that's one thing. But a bill that basically disregards the contributions of Italian American people is offensive to so many across this Commonwealth.
So one thing I don't agree with that he said there is if we want to replace it, because I think that somewhat is giving in. I don't think it should be replaced. There's a reason where that name came from. But I do appreciate the fact that he is standing up, because the easy thing to do, right, is to go along with the quote unquote mob, I think, nowadays, where, there's pressure from, a loud, let's say, vocal minority, and they're always trying to make a push for change. And we're going to see that manifestation when we tie it back to Shrewsbury here, because where you see this, at least where I've seen it in Shrewsbury, is really with the school calendar, right, of all places.
Yeah.
Right? So let's take a look, because what we want to do is we're going to go in and take a look at back in 2020, right, in the pandemic, going to a school committee meeting just before, like January 2020, right, where they're discussing the school calendar and what do we call this October holiday that falls on a Monday. And let's take a listen to the dialogue here.
I think our role is to think about the curriculum and how we teach subjects. And, listening to your experience and, what Ms. Clowder is saying, we're doing a good job of that. I want people or students to feel that they have a voice and they can talk about different perspectives and learn about all angles of whatever the subject matter is. So my personal opinion is that this is something that is not within our purview to rename a state holiday, but we definitely need to be on top of how it is being taught and what perspectives are in the curriculums.
So what's your thought there?
Yeah, I mean, she's right in the sense that we have to teach ideas, and we do have to teach the actual history. I don't necessarily think they mean that necessarily, but I do like the fact that in essence, we should understand the historical perspectives that people are bringing. If we do that, then we win. I think in this particular instance, we're basically, saying something. I don't know if there's a belief system there.
Right. And we'll get back to it at the end to determine that, because I know after putting this together, and I think what we're going to present today, I've never actually heard the true history, which we're going to say, the events that led up to it. I'm not sure that that's what they're teaching at Shrewsbury and Shrewsbury school system. I don't know that for sure, but I think their points are valid, or what they're saying the right thing. So we're going to carry on the same meeting here. And actually, it's going to show two things. Number one, it's going to show a comment from Jason Palisich, who was on the school committee at the time, talking about renaming of a holiday. And then it's also then going to go to a year later with Joe Sawyer actually talking about the change they ultimately made to the school calendar. So let's take a look at that.
Respect the opinion expressed by the person who wrote the letter. I guess you could say I'm of two minds on this. I don't feel it's the place of the school committee to get about renaming what is a state holiday. It's incumbent upon the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and whatever the Commonwealth of Massachusetts chooses to name a state holiday, we are bound by that.
And my recommendation in this calendar is to include language that Monday in October would be recognized as Indigenous Peoples Day in addition to Columbus Day. Columbus Day remains the official state holiday.
You actually have a conversation there that says, I don't think we should be in the business of renaming state holidays, right? And then a second breath, it's, well, we're going to do it anyway, even though that is still the name, official name of the holiday from the state. But because, a certain group of people complained, what's the harm in us of let's say, adding an additional name to the same holiday? Instead of creating, kind of what you said earlier, why not create another day, right? Why is it that day that we have to change specifically?
Yeah. And I think, again, going back to the fact that what do people complain about most about changing the holiday is really you're replacing one group with another group.
Right.
And neither group is necessarily that related to each other. Italian Americans were immigrants to the United States, mostly in the 1800s, and Native Americans have been here the whole time, right? So, they can have two separate holidays.
Yep, absolutely. Now, before we get into the actual history and go back a little history lesson here, let's listen to what Joe Sawyer says about his opinion, specifically about what we should be doing in the school system. Let's listen.
I think that we want to make sure that we're taking an approach where students understand an accurate version of what happened historically and how that looks from different perspectives.
So now we have our audience of our students today, and we're going to try to take you down this accurate representation of history. And where we're going to start, we're going to go back to post-Civil War. So we're talking about 1880s, 1890s is where we're going to go back to, and where the country was and kind of what that wave of immigration was specifically related to that Italian community. So let's take a listen.
In the southern United States, Italian immigrants pour in following the aftermath of the Civil War. They rapidly replaced the labor of freed slaves on plantations. In New Orleans, many settle in the French Quarter, which becomes known as Little Sicily.
Over 80% of the Italian immigrants came from southern Italy. They were dark complected, and as a result, they were treated as people of color when they arrived in America.
They were treated as not even citizens. They were called subhumans because of the color of their skin.
So a lot of parallels with what you see today, right?
Yep.
The way they were treated. But keep in mind, the Italians replaced, right, freed slaves on plantation work. And I think if you actually would go back in that same time frame, you would see advertisements where they would actually show wages, right? You would have white, Irish, and Italian, and the pay would go down, right. Depending on where you came from.
Yeah.
So totally different from where we look at today. Immigration obviously is a big topic nowadays, but compare it with the living conditions then, night and day, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, and people forget that history is really the migration of people consistently throughout history. People have consistently moved from one place to another. Tribes in North America were replaced by other tribes that replaced them.
Yeah.
Right? People got replaced. The white Protestants that had been here a long time were now being slowly replaced by the European, mostly Southern European Catholics, right? So a lot was happening. This is the history of history. And so these folks, they were the replacement, right? And they were treated just as poorly as all replacements are always treated.
Correct. And now we're going to go back to where this actually started. The event, there's a specific event that predicated the Columbus Day as it, at the time why it was created. And it really started around in New Orleans, right? So the town of New Orleans, you don't really think of New Orleans as kind of this, area where you would have a lot of this contentious piece around, let's say, immigration, but there was. And we're going to look at this event and how that led to Columbus Day. Let's take a listen.
On October 15, 1890, New Orleans Police Commissioner David Hennessy is shot and killed on a darkened street. There is no positive identification of the shooters, but public anger quickly turns against the Italian community. Local newspapers freely blame Dagos for the murder. Hundreds of Italians are rounded up and 19 men are ultimately charged with the murder. But a jury of their peers finds them not guilty.
The fever pitch newspapers published stories again and again of these dark immigrants, these criminals, these low persons to America. And eventually a mob came to the jail.
5,000 to 10,000 people. They came that next morning. They broke into the prison. They shot 9 of them, and the other 2 were hanged. One on a tree and one on a lamppost outside the prison.
President Benjamin Harrison was one of the few public officials who was appalled by the lynchings. In an effort to help promote peace and understanding throughout the country, he called for a national observance of Columbus Day.
In the wake of the lynching in New Orleans, for so many Italian Americans, the idea of our belonging here is in question. And Columbus was a wonderful spearhead for our people in establishing the idea that we've been with you from the very beginning.
That's how Columbus Day started. It started on the backs of the largest lynching in America.
So there you have it. The largest lynching in America is what predicated the formation of a Columbus Day, because of the fact that this was a big national story, and even up to the president said there's some contention with Italy. One of the things they didn't mention there, which I found fascinating, was after the Civil War, we somewhat had demilitarized as America, right? Because we had the two sides. We hadn't really reformed, let's say, military. Italy at the time had the 4th largest navy in the world. Italy, after this, threatens to blockade the Mississippi River, which at the time, right, was a massive trade route as far as getting goods up and down United States. So here you have like a global conflict based off of, you know, an event that happens in New Orleans that ultimately leads to the celebration, or at least using Columbus, right, as this way to kind of mitigate some national, global, let's say, tensions between countries, right? Interesting, right?
It's totally interesting, you know, because it all fits together. If you think about the 1880s, 1870s, before that, a lot of the migration was coming over, especially from Southern Europe. You had the ends of the Napoleonic Wars, right? You had terrible strife in Europe at the time, but you had highly militarized Europe, right? So to your point, Italy's got all these ships. They're not fighting anybody right now, right? And the idea that happened was, you know, this was also a political decision, right? A smart decision by the president to appease a power that he needed to appease, right? But I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't genuinely concerned. I think he really was genuinely concerned about the murders. But it shows the fact that, you know, there's a lot going on, right? And so, and you noticed in one of those clips, it showed mafia.
Right.
This was the first time that term was floated around in America. And it was used as a derogatory term, primarily to say, look, this is a gang of thugs. These are people that are out to get you. And, you know, they're not good people. That's what the other side was saying. And of course, the tragedy ensued.
Right. And the next clip we're going to go to is talk a little bit more about why President Harrison ultimately made the decision he did about creating this day, this proclamation. And it was more than just, you know, this specific event too. There were some other things around immigrant culture in general, like you had mentioned, how this whole thought that, hey, there's this big group of people really had this negative connotation to immigration, and they tried to at least try to be a little bit more welcoming. So let's take a listen on that as well.
President Harrison is not just seeking to appease the Italian community in calling for a celebration of Columbus Day. It is also to be a national holiday for Native Americans. The 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, where U.S. soldiers brutally killed nearly 200 Sioux men, women, and children, is still a fresh wound on the national psyche.
President Harrison's proclamation of the holiday says that this is a time to celebrate the making of a new class of American citizens, the new immigrants and the Native Americans. And so it was meant as a unifying holiday.
So ironically, it was meant as a unifying holiday, and now it's being used as a divisive holiday, really around the natives and the immigrants of how do we coalesce, how do we live together in America and create a better country, is really why it was created. But yet now it's such a negative connotation to the day.
Yeah, it goes back to the idea of these using icons, right? To your point earlier, Columbus was a folk hero in some sense. Davy Crockett, folks like that, right? They were big names, right? And so I think Harrison, because a lot of people called it Discovery Day, even before Columbus Day, Italians celebrated Discovery Day. But I love the fact that in his mind, what he was creating was this unifying holiday, not knowing that, 130 years later or 140 years later, people would be divided over something that he wanted to be unifying.
And it was somewhat of a timing thing, if you look about it. It just happened to be 1891, and then that whole, after the lynchings, and it took a little time, it was 1892, and they're like, gee, let's say it's 1892, we think this is a good time to, 400 years ago, 1492.
Yeah.
So I think it was more about that, of just that there was a lot of connections. And one of the things I want to go to the next clip here is, I don't think people realize how many connections we have to Columbus as a concept. And that's where I want to talk about and go to this next clip, because that first day, right, was Discovery Day in 1892, was a single day. It wasn't that this is going to be every day forever.
Right.
That didn't happen until 1937, I believe. But let's just take a look at some of the other connections to Columbus that we have as a country.
The 1891 lynching of Italians in New Orleans did not occur in a vacuum. It was but one expression of the growing animosity towards Italian immigrants, both nationally and locally in the southern United States. Nationally, the event coincided with a push to pass legislation that would limit Italian immigration to the United States and bar Italians from entering the nation entirely. It also occurred in tandem with the growing eugenics movement and the publishing of political cartoons that depicted Italian immigrants escaping from the slums of Europe with words such as murderer and criminal written on their backs. It took place at the same time that immigration officials were racializing Southern Italians when the U.S. government created the designation Southern Italian on immigration documents.
They even had created a separate race, right, at the time to even be more negative. So there was just all kinds of, propaganda out there that was really negative towards the Italians and really didn't put a very good spin on what was going on in the country at that time.
Yeah, and what's interesting is after that one-day proclamation, over the years, Italian groups did still celebrate Discovery Day unofficially. There were cities that did it, there were towns that did it, there were groups that did it, but it wasn't a national holiday, right? But what's interesting is, it was the idea that we've got these people that are coming for, to work or whatever, and just people that didn't like them.
Yeah. So we're gonna move here into when and how it did become a national holiday. Because to your point, one of the groups, and actually put together a lot of these videos here, is the Knights of Columbus. I think a lot of people have heard of the Knights of Columbus. They actually were back in like 1882, and actually New Haven, Connecticut is where the Knights of Columbus were founded, out here in New England. And one of the reasons that they were created was because at the time, this is a time that you had no workman's comp. You didn't have insurance. If you were injured at work or killed, that too bad for you. You had kids at home and family at home, and the Knights of Columbus was founded to help Catholics, both the Irish and the Italians, who were very Catholic, who also were the ones in very dangerous jobs and the ones taking a lot of these low-paying jobs. If an issue happened, the Knights of Columbus would try to help that family and be sustainable, right? So that's why that group had been founded. And to your point, they were along the way one of the key reasons why Columbus Day did become a national holiday, which we're going to look at right now.
In 1907, Colorado becomes the first state in the nation to establish Columbus Day as a legal holiday. Calderone and Noce, along with the Knights of Columbus, would also be the catalysts behind the creation of Columbus Day as a federal holiday. Following the founding of the American nation, our leaders were looking for a hero that was free of association from the British, and they selected Columbus. In the years that followed, the feminine version of Columbus's name, Columbia, is personified as this goddess. Columbia becomes the symbol of the American nation that actually predates Uncle Sam. We also see just a plethora of places, features, institutions named in Columbus's honor, from the Columbia River to Columbus, Ohio, Columbia Records, Columbia University, which had previously been King's College, of course, the nation's capital, Washington, the District of Columbia, companies like Columbia Sportswear, CBS, which is the Columbia Broadcast System, and then, of course, the moon rocket and the space shuttle.
So you have a lot of connections to the Columbia. Actually, even in my own family, my wife's grandmother's family, the eldest daughter was a course named Columbia, right? And that's just what you did. So it's really the connection there to that Columbia. And then if you saw in the clip there, the Hail Columbia, prior to the Star Spangled Banner, what was the song that we had as our national anthem? Hail Columbia.
Yeah.
So it's not, to your point, it's that folk hero or this concept of Columbus, not the man himself, correct?
Right, yeah. It's the founding, Columbus found the West Indies, right? So, it really, if you think about it, why is it associated with America or the United States? It primarily because it was the first time that Europeans, it really wasn't the first time, but it was the first time the Europeans came and found something, right? We later knew that, the Basques were fishing in New England way before Columbus went to West Indies. But the fact of the matter is, it's an idea over a person, I think.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing is there was other groups, even if you went past when, say, Columbus Day, before it was an official holiday in 1937, back in the 1920s, there was some other anti-Catholic and anti-Italian sentiment here from groups that we would really deem very supremacist groups, right? And so we're going to take a look at that right here.
In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan organized to stop Columbus Day celebrations and oppose Columbus statues. Cross burnings was one of its tactics. The Klan was anti-immigrant, anti-Hispanic, anti-Italian, and anti-Catholic. Its war on Columbus became a way to advance its white, supremacist narrative against immigrants, people of color, and Catholics.
So the original fight against Columbus Day was, right, from, they say, white supremacist or against immigrants, against change, in essence, right?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned before, history was essentially migrations of people throughout the globe. And that resistance or reluctance to change is what causes a lot of this, which you do see a lot today as well, right?
Oh, for sure. Change scares people, and so in this instance, it was Italians being Catholic was actually the prime driver for, racists and bigots like the KKK to go after them. They felt that a Catholic had its allegiance to the Pope in the Vatican, not to America. And that, by the way, went all the way up to when JFK was running for president. That was a big deal. He was the first Catholic that was actually running for president, and it scared a lot of people up into the 1960s, right? So what changes sometimes doesn't change.
Right. Yeah, and I think people just don't take time to think about that, and because they think it's hard to comprehend. Like, you really thought that people had more allegiance to the Pope than they did of the country they lived in? But, it's a different times, right? And people don't take time to listen to it. So the last clip here I want to show is just kind of, in summary, saying, the reason why the day was created was from this lynching, from the real oppression of Italian immigrants coming to the country, and how they were treated, and kind of making trying to take what was a massive wrong and making it a right, and really how Columbus is really tied to not more about the concept of being an American, regardless of where you come from, regardless of your nationality, and that's really what the crux of Columbus Day is. It's not about the man Columbus. So let's take a look.
Columbus has been a model for generations of Americans, not because of the way he administered a territory, but because he had the courage to change the world. Columbus did not discover a perfect world, nor did he build one. but he opened up the possibility for those who came after him to create a better one. That is the promise and the responsibility of America, a nation that we must not allow to be defined by the mistakes of its past, but instead be defined by its continued progress in the pursuit of freedom and justice for all.
You know, people have persecuted each other around the world for thousands of years, right? I mean, it's just never stopped. And I think the idea of celebrating a culture that had a tough time, I think, is noble. I also think celebrating any culture that's had a brutal time, Native Americans included, certainly some terrible, terrible things. And we should celebrate those cultures and learn more about those cultures. And that's what this is, really. And I think the anger does come from the fact that, look, I'm an Italian American. I want to support, I am an American first, but I love my heritage. And I want to support that in some way. I don't think that's too much to ask, really.
I don't. And what I really like the concept of is really about, it wasn't about, you know, Columbus and what he did or didn't do, but it said it enabled others to come to America or pursue that drive, that dream of that freedom or whatever that piece is. And what does it really mean to be American, and kind of that concept of, you know, whether not say floating around the world, but having the courage to go out there and make that change, like you said, in hard times.
Yeah.
You know, you were in a really hard situation, having that courage to go try to make a better life for yourself. And I think that's really important, and what Columbus Day means to so many people. What I want to leave with is kind of a little ode to, you know, my wife's family, and just the memory of the Brunetti family. They, like many others, they came over through Ellis Island back actually in the early 1900s, and were those Italian immigrants who did, you know, settle here for a better life for them and their families. So with that, I'm Greg Richards.
And I'm Brian Costello.
And we are the Unselects.